So, Mordor, the heart of all that is foul in Middle-earth, and the first of the Orcish factions that we're going to be looking at in the new faction overview series for the most recent version of Third Age Reforged. And, well, when it comes to Mordor, again, much like many of the other sort of more well-known factions, the history is rather long, of course, with Sauron. Melkor's successor to all that is dark is orchestrating things from atop Barad-dûr, and indeed in this little walk-on segment, as much as you can't see it because it's a little bit difficult to set it up, it is on the Barad-dûr map that does exist within the game. Mordor as well, the industrial powerhouse that they are, a little bit more than just the ashen lands in the north that they are most well known for. There are more fertile grounds further into its territory, bordering Khand and Rhûn on the more eastern edges of their borders. But that is not really what we're here to talk about today. We're going to be talking about what they're all about militarily. And again, we'll go through this first and foremost, talking a little bit about some of the overall strengths and weaknesses that they have going for them. Starting with the strengths, and the first and most obvious one that perhaps they have is the fact that they have high numbers. Not the highest numbers, it must be said. On average, certainly one, perhaps more than one of the other Orcish factions actually lean more heavily on having more numerical advantages than Mordor do, for reasons that we'll get into when we talk about some of Mordor's other strengths, but all of the Orcish factions will be leaning on this to some extent or another, which gives them that multifaceted nature. It's useful to have numbers whether you're on an open field, whether you're on a slightly more constrained but still pitched battle, or whether you're on the attack or the defence in a siege. When you're utilising these numbers correctly, you can put them in and around your other types of units, and it makes you able to sustain losses, it makes you able to really pack a defensive position with a lot of numbers very effectively, and it allows you to cover the battlefield as well. And in many ways, you know, it may be the thing which comes to mind when you think about the Orcish factions first and foremost, but it's not the only thing that Mordor have going for them. Indeed, an elite selection is the second strength that I've listed, and that's because when it comes to bodyguard tier units, Mordor may very well have the biggest breadth of bodyguard units that the game has to offer. I won't say that categorically because we will learn a little bit more about that as we go through, and I wouldn't want to say things off the top of my head that I'm not completely sure about. But I am sure about the fact that the selection of elite units that Mordor have is very impressive. They have pretty much something for every kind of situation. If you want to spend a lot of money on a single kind of unit, you have a lot of options with Mordor. You have armour-piercing archers, you have high-end defensive infantry, you have high-end offensive infantry, and you also have more specialised units such as their Caragor riders as a mounted option, monstrous infantry such as the Olag High. They have the Beasts of Gorgoroth, which are effectively an elephant class units, and also completely unique things like the Nazgul, which are very small but incredibly elite infantry units. And when you combine all of this with the high numbers, it's this combination that really make Mordor tick, and that really does feed into the third thing that we're going to be talking about here, and that is their overall options. When you consider the lower tier base that you can build Mordor from, sort of weaving in some of these higher tier options that they do have available to them, you can make a number of pretty effective compositions with Mordor, all of which end up feeling kind of similar, but they sort of protrude in certain areas as far as their strengths go. So if you were to go for a more aggressive army, you would perhaps go with something like the Olag High and the Elephant class units on the forefront if you wanted to really batter people in a more open and aggressive sense. But you can also settle in to a little bit more of a defensive playstyle using numerical halberds and using fodder units in and around stuff like the Nazgul and your Black Númenórean units of Durthang in order to be able to really dig in and play in that way. So it's one of the things which I have criticised a couple of the factions about previously, where they are very focused around certain things. Mordor actually are not. They have pretty much an option for most situations, to be fair. They are better at some things than others, but there will rarely be a situation or an opponent that you're going into if you do play as Mordor that you won't at least be able to be competitive in based on composition alone, and then you can put matters entirely into the hands of the skill of the players involved, which is useful. If you're going into a blind pick kind of battle situation, you could do far worse than Mordor, I think, as a result of this. But they are not without their weaknesses, of course, and the first one that I'm going to mention is pretty much the thing that I left out a little bit, and I've tacitly referred to this as simply mid-tier. It's not entirely truthful, but they do have a pretty clear split between their entry-level units and those very expensive kind of 1,000 gold plus kind of units that they have at the sharp end of their faction. In that middle zone, among all of the Orcish factions, aside from possibly the Misty Mountains, they have maybe the sparsest in this area. They do have options here, good heavy axe unit and a good heavy spear unit, and that does provide you most of what you need in this area, but again, you would, compared to some of their peers, they do lack a little bit in this area. Most of what you would consider to be weaknesses, you do have to look at their peers first and foremost to see what they're all about. And we mentioned previously with Imladris and their archers are still fantastic. It's just not quite up to the same standard in some ways as some of their elven counterparts, and this is true for Mordor with their mid-tiers as well. When you consider stuff like the Uruk-hai Infantry of Isengard, the Guardians of Khan Dûm from Angmar, Mordor don't really have an equivalent in this regard. And that brings us on to, neatly really, to the second weakness I'm going to mention, which is you can't pick everything. And this may seem obvious, this is true of every faction, but with Mordor it's especially important because if you get too greedy with those high tier units, you're not going to be able to create a comprehensive army which is going to be able to stand. And this is where having that slightly lower selection of mid-tier units can be a little bit more of a pain for you, because you're going to have to rely on those lower end units to be that anchor from which your elites can go forward and potentially win you many battles that you take part in as Mordor. And ultimately this is where the overall options can be a little bit of a double-sided blade, really, because you're going to need to use good judgment in the composition phase. Otherwise you're going to spend an awful lot of money on units which your opposition may have the obvious answers to. A good example of this will be your elephant class units. If your opposition has really prepared for that kind of unit, you're going to find it quite difficult to utilise them in the way that you would want. And if you combine this with the fact that if you then spend a lot of money on other very expensive units, sort of narrowing your focus a little bit more, making your army smaller and taking away from those high numbers we mentioned at the top of this section, you can land yourself in a bit of a sticky situation. But it's one of those judgment calls that you've got to make. It's, you have a lot of options, you've just got to pick the right ones for the situation at hand, and you can't afford to get too greedy either. Mordor are not the only faction for which this is the case, but it's probably the one so far for which it's the most apparent, but this is something that I'm sure we'll be revisiting with a few of the others as we go through. And the final thing is really the one obvious gap in an army like this. Many an army that utilises pikes really can help offset maybe a little bit of a lack of quality in their low tiers, but Mordor have no pikes. They do have access to a halberdier unit which will do kind of the same job with a bit of armour piercing thrown in for good measure, but pikes are really useful for that range they give you. They can really help blunt enemy quality, which can be very good for you if you're playing as a faction like this where you need to sort of babysit your lower tier units a little bit potentially on that front line and really maybe tar pit, in melee terms anyway, the enemy into a fight that's a bit of an attritional ground war. Mordor can engage in these kind of battles with purely their high numbers, but pikes would really round this off to being maybe a little bit too effective, and that's why Mordor don't have any pikes as such. But it is still a notable absence in their roster, especially when you consider that certainly in two of their Orcish companion factions, shall we call them, pikes are a very big part of what they do, but Mordor have to do without, and they have to simply comfort themselves with the fact that they have the best elite selection among the orcs anyway. It's all about really what you want to prioritise more, balance or having those extremes that Mordor are very good at. But anyway, now that we've spoken a little bit about Mordor in general terms, let's take to the grassy plain and see what this army looks like when it's laid out before us. So, as we behold Mordor's force, there is one aspect of the army that I'm going to have to do separately, and I settled on the cavalry purely because I could squeeze one artillery piece in, but not 3 cavalry units here at the end, so this will again be a bit of a two-parter on the grassy plain. But you can see here that even when you're just bringing one, or in some cases 2 units where armour upgrades come into play, Mordor even here look like a fairly numerous force, which is rather fitting, of course, but we shall start with the most basic unit, and in Mordor's case it's one of their more iconic picks as well, considering the fact that many a force, this is the kind of unit which is a bit throwaway. In Mordor it's very throwaway, and that's really what sets them apart. This is of course the Orc Fodder, another unit which, in terms of unit model, I don't believe they've actually been changed too much, if at all actually, since vanilla as well. They weren't called Fodder back then, they were called Orc Band, I believe. They're still very much the same sort of thing, albeit their exact stats and how and what they do have changed a little bit as the game has evolved over the years, and you can see that they still wield their spears, so as much as they are very, very cheap at only 100 gold, you will struggle to find a unit cheaper than they. They will still have an added impact against cavalry, though you can see from their stats that they are not really up to doing much. The attack of 1 and the charge bonus of 2 is pitiful. They're not the only unit in the game, I think, with a melee attack of 1, but they are one of the only ones to have defensive stats as poor as this as well, with only 1 in each of armour, defensive skill and shield. They're very much here to die. They will get in the way of fatal blows of more important units, and ultimately they will give your army a bigger look to it. You can't be relying on these guys, of course, to win any 1v1 engagements at all, really, but they can act for a good foil for many of Mordor's higher tier options, which we'll go into a little bit later on. But yeah, 100, once upon a time, they were completely free for the first unit, though that was done away with. Now you have 100 is still rather a token amount of money in the grand scheme of things anyway, but yeah, they are very much the quintessential meat shield unit, and it's very fitting that they are a part of Mordor. Now weirdly, you may be wondering what trolls are doing on the first layer here, but not this guy so much as the ones in behind, the troll drummers. Now the troll drummers only cost 300, and that's because in terms of their own combat skills, as far as trolls go, they're not that great. They do have 4 hit points, so they will take a little bit of a beating initially, but in terms of their stats, they're not going to be that damaging. Because of the size of the unit model, they can still scatter formations, so if the enemy are dug in and you want to try and get through maybe some long weapon units, you could use the troll drummers fairly effectively for that, but certainly in comparison to the absolutely monstrous power that some of the stronger units of trolls in the game, Mordor included, which we'll get into a little bit later, can display, that is not what the troll drummers are for. They are here to increase the morale of your nearby units, which is a very useful thing when you're talking about a faction like Mordor, because you really need your lower tier units to be pointing in the right direction for as long as possible during the battle, because if those numbers abandon you, like I said, your elite units, while they are fairly numerous in terms of the options that you have, and many of them are very strong, they will not get the job done all on their own, especially when you consider that 1-to-1 against a few other factions in the game, Mordor cannot rely purely on their high-end power. They do need those numbers around them to really be the complete package, and one of the ways in which you can ensure that happens for the longest possible amount of time is to inspire your nearby troops with the troll drummers. And at 300, I think you're going to be seeing quite a lot of them as well, because it's not a huge amount of cost, and the boost that they can give you is still very useful, and they will at least take a little bit more of a beating individually than something like some Orc Fodder will, for example. So multifaceted in that way, but very much a morale battery first and foremost. Now we get on to the meat and potatoes of the Mordor army, the stuff which is actually going to start to at least pose a little bit more of a threat to opposition units. The Orc Infantry, again, in terms of stats, you can see that it's a massive jump up from the Orc Fodder just in front of them. A recruitment cost of 450 is fairly par for the course when it comes to a unit of basic line infantry. Their stats are going to be a little bit lower than the equivalents from the Western Kingdoms of Men, for example, but they make up for this by having more numbers per unit. For example, where the Gondorians had 203, the Orc Infantry have 253, which is a significant boost when you consider that each one of those has access to the stats that you see before you. But yeah, again, the key here with the first couple of tiers of Mordor units is going to be those numbers. They're not going to win fights fairly, as it were. They are going to outnumber their opposition, try and swarm them, and the armour and the defensive values that the Orc Infantry have are not absolutely dreadful for the kind of unit that they are. They will keep themselves alive well enough, and that will, the longer that they can stay up and running, the more that you can leverage those numbers and the greater your chance of victory is. You cannot upgrade the armour on these guys, however. They come as is. That is not true for the shock infantry option that you have at the entry level of Mordor's more capable units, shall we call them. The Orc Maulers, again, 253 units, especially when you consider the armour-piercing sting that these two-handed weapons do provide you. That's quite a lot of armour-piercing heading towards the enemy. You can see the obvious thing here is the big uptick in terms of attack and charge, but the dramatic downshift in terms of their total defence. Obviously no shield, their defensive skill being a two-handed kind of axe unit really, but some of them wield sort of spiked clubs and spiked spears, sort of a ramshackle group indeed. But yeah, their defensive values are not great. They are going to have a very limited shelf life. There are a lot of them, so they will stay in the fight as long as their morale doesn't collapse just based on how many of them there are. But you know, they are going to start to melt away pretty quickly, especially without support. But the armor piercing can be useful. You can upgrade the armor on these guys, and it gives them that Moranon look, one tick of armor up. It will give them a little bit more resilience in melee to the right kinds of units, also a little bit more of a resilience against missiles as well, arrows, but you know, they're still going to be fairly vulnerable to that sort of thing. Armor piercing shock troops, especially at the low level, are very focused in what they're all about. You can definitely pack a lot of armor piercing into your army with something like this, but you do need to utilise them well, because they will not have the staying power of the Uruk infantry that they fight alongside. And in melee terms, nor will they have the same staying power as the one phalanx unit that Mordor have available to them. I did mention Mordor's lack of pikes. They do have a unit of halberdiers. The Uruk halberds are basic in terms of what they offer, but you can't really thumb your nose at basic when you're talking about Mordor, and ultimately the armour piercing will only increase when you bring the halberds. Obviously a bonus against cavalry and an effectiveness against armour. They will be outranged by pikes, and that is where Mordor's swarm tactics, if you cannot break a pike formation with some of your high mass units, of which Mordor do have many options, that can be a bit of a problem. But like I said, you do have the ability to counteract the weakness that these halberds may have. And if you are on the defence as Mordor, you know, you want to be setting an anchor in place. This is going to be one of your most obvious options to do so. 600 is not bargain basement prices, but it's not too expensive either when you consider it next to many other phalanx units in the game. So yeah, you do need to watch out for the fact as well that they are unshielded. Going to be one of the first ports of call for enemy skirmishers to try and whittle down your army here, especially considering if it gets into the late game, those phalanx units can be the difference between you outlasting your enemy and you faltering before them. Now we move on to some of the specialist, one of the specialist units anyway. They have been a bit of a controversial unit in the past, I suppose. The Blackguard of Barad-dûr, Angmar have their own equivalent to this, the Great Shield Infantry, and they're not really typical line infantry in the overall sense of the word. I mean, their stats are, they look good when you consider, an attack of 8, I mean, that's not great, but as a unit of more defensive line infantry, it doesn't necessarily need to be. A total defense of 20, though, most of that is in the shield, and that means they're going to be very resilient against arrow fire from the front, but they're not necessarily particularly good melee combatants. If they flounder in their purpose, they can be taken apart pretty readily, and it's very much an all or nothing kind of unit. You can smash your way through defensive positions or hold on to your own defensive positions utilising this unit as its centrepiece, or they can be thoroughly outclassed by units. I mean, when you consider, you know, that outside of the shield score, they would have a total defense of 10, and for a unit that costs 850, that is low. So that's the weakness, but the upside is high mass and mass pushing. You can shove units out of the way with this unit, and it's been something of a controversial thing in the past, but I do think it is necessary in the game. Otherwise you would end up with sort of mosh pit style fights or lines that never move anywhere when certain factions are involved. So they are a bit of a stalemate breaker one way or the other, because if it fails, Mordor can very often find themselves in a bit of a hole financially, and the rest of their army not really knowing what to do against a defence that have withstood the mass push from this unit. But yeah, they are not a typical unit. They are very much a specialist, and if you can utilise them well, they can carry you to victory. They can really seize that momentum, but if you don't, they can really put you into that financial hole, like I said. Now moving on, just shy of the 1,000 gold mark, we have the Sauron's Will. That's actually their old model in the picture up there. Nowadays they look a little bit more menacing, very large axes, and they're an upper tier unit of shock infantry. They do frighten nearby enemy units as well, which does have a bit of an effect. Again, if Mordor get the wind in their sails and really get that momentum, like I said with the Great Shield Infantry just before, they can really start to break enemy units off. They can do a lot of damage pretty quickly. big armor piercing damage as well, an attack of 20 and a charge bonus of 15. If you get a clean charge off on foot, which like I've said in the past is more difficult with infantry but not impossible, you can do big damage very, very quickly. Even here though, considering the higher cost of this unit, and we're starting to get into the realms now where the units are getting a little bit smaller, only 143, everything else outside of their bodyguard tier units in terms of infantry have a size over 200, so it goes, again, plays into that numbers game that Mordor like to play. But again, as a heavy axe unit, their defensive values are going to be a little bit lower than the equivalents. If you cast your mind back to the Imladris swordsmen, for example, which were a little over 1,000 but still in the same sort of ballpark, their defensive scores were much, much higher, but attack scores comparable with armor piercing, inspiring nearby troops as well, kind of like a diet bodyguard unit in that respect, but they can't keep themselves alive to the same extent that that class of unit can. And finally, if you are looking to lay on a solid defence, then the centrepiece of that is almost certainly going to be the Morgul Chosen 750. This is really the unit in terms of Mordor's mid-tier, which really does fill that role of being a centrepiece kind of unit, but it is Mordor's only option. I don't think the Saurons will have got that staying power that you need, and I think the Blackguard of Barad-dûr is so specialised that it does play into that as well. But the Morgul Chosen, in terms of their armour, in terms of their shield, this is much more of a balanced defensive approach than the Blackguard we saw before. Their attack is not great, but again, they are pretty much entirely a defensive unit through and through. So if you want to lay on that sort of heavy metal front line, akin to what you might expect to see from Angmar and Isengard, then the Morgul Chosen are probably your best bet of doing so. 750 is not a huge amount. Of course, they have a bonus fighting cavalry as well, which can be useful, more so on an open field. But I think we're more used to seeing them be that sort of solid brick of armour in the centre of the Mordor roster. And when you consider that there are 203 of them, they are good value for money, but just don't expect them to outdamage too many of their foes. Now, we move on to the very extensive array of melee bodyguard unit that Mordor have available to them. You can see that, I mean, it is bulked out a little bit by the fact that one of them, much like the elves that we saw last time around, do have actually a visual change to one of their bodyguard units when the armour is upgraded, but the Uruk Chieftains are the most basic of these, and it's a fairly rare thing. I mean, I think they may be the only sword and shield infantry unit in the game that has armour piercing. They are the most vanilla, shall we say, of all of Mordor's bodyguard units. They're also the cheapest, only 1,000. But in terms of their stats, I mean, they are going to be a little bit of a step down from what we're about to see, but there's certainly no slouches in melee. That armour piercing really does give them a leg up on certain types of infantry they may face off against. If that's not the be-all and end-all in an engagement, though, then the chieftains will need a little bit of support to get their job done. Second hit point will help them with that, but overall dependable, albeit the least maybe dramatic of all of Mordor's options. Then, however, we have the black swords of the Black Númenóreans, starting with the unupgraded Temple Executioners. Again, 1,200, so a little bit more expensive, but the stats do go up fairly significantly. They inspire nearby troops marching forth from their fortress at Durthang. Big defensive values, that second hit point. And then they also have the armour upgrade as well, if you do want to give them that little bit of extra defence, and why wouldn't you? Really does push you onto that next level. When you see a total defence score of 30, that's when you know that your unit is more than capable of looking after itself. There are several units of heavy swordsmen which are going to be stronger than the Temple Executioners, even with this armour upgrade, because some of them have that third hit point. Rare enough, but it is a sign that the Temple Executioners at the very least are not the strongest of this class of unit in the game, but when you combine them with all the numbers that Mordor have, they can still be a very scary foe indeed. Perhaps not quite as scary though as the new version of the Olag High. Now, in the last version of the game, trolls were a little bit disappointing in many ways, because all you really needed to do was stick a unit of shock infantry against them, or a unit with sufficiently high melee attack, and they would melt away pretty quickly. That is not the case now, however. Trolls are a very dangerous force. They're very difficult to take down. The same kind of units are still good against them, but you are going to need to work for those kills. It's not all rosy, however, for the trolls, because their cost has increased as well. 1,500 is a lot to pay for a unit which is ultimately going to end the game dead. You're never really going to finish a battle with your trolls intact unless you win by a landslide. But when you look, again, trolls are one of those where when you look at the stats, it's a little bit difficult to quantify, because monstrous infantry units, there are only 16 of them, but again, 8 hit points, huge amount of attack, armor piercing, they frighten the enemy. Inspiring their nearby allies as well is good, because if you end up in a really chaotic battle, if you're trying to force your way through in a siege, then the Olag High will make sure that any fodder or any low tier Uruk infantry that are fighting alongside them are more likely to stick around and give them a helping hand. But yeah, anyone who's seen any replays with the trolls in them in their current form knows what they're all about. They are a blunt instrument, as you would probably expect, but they do their job better now, and it's going to be something that Mordor, I think, rely upon more often than not as well. Something which is pretty much a unique thing still in Third Age is the Nazgul as well. The Nazgul, who look a little bit different in the picture. They used to not have their shoulder pauldrons, but now they do, as well as their gauntlets. Again, a difficult unit to compare. 1500 once more, 10 of them, so slightly less than the Olag High, 6 hit points. The stats are very, very scary though when you compare the two. The defense scores are higher, defensive skill less in terms of the attack. They do kind of the same thing, only the Olag High are a little bit better when they're on the attack, giving you the momentum. The Nazgul are better for you when the enemy doesn't know they're there, because they can be throwing their forces into a fight, and if the Nazgul go unnoticed, they will slowly but surely ratchet up a very significant kill count over the course of the battle, albeit if they get isolated, they can be a little bit easier to take down than the trolls, because the trolls can fight their way out due to their bigger mass and the fact that you can force power through units. You can't really do that with the Nazgul because they have the same mass as individual soldiers, and when there's only 10 of them, of course, they can get stuck. So using the Nazgul can be a little bit of a tightrope act, but if you can get them in and amongst the rest of your army, it just means that they are those silent killers that you need. And of course they have all of the bells and whistles as well. Inspiration of nearby troops, effective against armour, frightening nearby enemy infantry. Can't really argue too much with that. Now then, the ranged units. We start off with the entry level unit, and again, one of the most significant units that Mordor have in their repertoire, the humble Orc Javelins. Time and time again we've seen the Orc Javelins be a pain, especially for opposition who are trying to defend a fortress, because what do you do against the Orc Javelins in such a situation? Their stats are pretty pitiful, albeit not as pitiful actually as their Orc fodder brethren, albeit they do cost 400 gold more, so it's not an equivalent. They do have a bonus fighting cavalry as well, because they do have a spear as their melee weapon. The main issue though is their missile attack. 5 javelins, of course, so that means that they're armor piercing. It's not really the sort of unit that you can afford to simply pepper with arrow fire, because they're so cheap. Mordor would accept that. The only way to deal with them in a completely cost-effective manner is to run them down with cavalry off a charge, though even then their spears can be a bit of an issue. They are a puzzle of a unit to try and deal with, and we've seen that many a time. Cheap javelins across the board are pretty much this way inclined, and the Orc Javelins are probably the best example of such a unit in the game. Albeit, they aren't exactly match winners. There are many javelins that are much, much better than them in the game, especially some of the really high-end ones, but as part of a complete army, you'll scarcely see the Orc Javelins not in a Mordor force, especially in a siege. Maybe less so in a pitch battle, because it's going to be a little bit more difficult to maybe finagle these guys into being completely cost-effective in that regard, but still. Now then, moving on to the basic archers of Mordor, the Uruk archers. Of course, when you look at their stats, the main thing when you're talking about a line archer like this, for lack of a better term, is how well are they going to be able to trade with their opposition. From a stats perspective, missile attack is going to be slightly lower than many of the Western Kingdoms of Men, certainly lower than the elves and such. Their defensive scores as well, I mean, their armour is not terrible, but overall they are still going to be outclassed. But the main thing that they're going to have in their favour here is the fact they have slightly more numbers. So it's not quite so simple when you start factoring in all of those things into account, like how are these fights going to go. There's no real way of knowing in a real battle situation who's going to come out on top, but Mordor ultimately winning skirmish fights is not the most important thing for them. Generally speaking, you're going to see them be aggressive more often than not. So if you can take away the enemy's strength slightly, which the Uruk archers are pretty good at, they can at least blunt an opposition's skirmishing force, which is something which many an evil faction in the game does prioritise more than outright winning them. Not all, but most. And that's what the Uruk archers are going to be doing more often than not. 600 is reasonably low. I mean, many of the other forces that are going to prioritise heavier archers are going to spend far more than this. But it is very much a force that is all about cost efficiency rather than winning many fights. But Mordor are more blessed in this regard than some of their Orc brethren are when it comes to long-range fighting. And That is more apparent as you go up the roster. 800 for a unit of Ardenheim Shadow Bows, but Rangers are not something that every faction possesses, and Mordor are quite fortunate to have Black Númenóreans on their side that can do this. Of course, Rangers have got big missile attacks. 8 is significant for an archer unit, especially when you consider the range that Rangers tend to have. And as far as Rangers go, they're decently resilient as well. They're, in terms of armour and defensive skill together, it's a good combination. You know, you still wouldn't choose them to get involved in a skirmish fight directly because it's still not really their forte. But the Ardenheim ones are going to be better in this regard with an armour of 7 than some of the more lightweight ones that we will get onto at a later date. But there are also Rangers that are going to be doing more damage as well, which is the primary focus of a unit of lighter but longer range archers like this. Anyway, 800 is a lot of money, but especially if you're on the defence, there's no real reason not to bring the shadow bows because they're going to give you that damage, they're going to give you that presence on the field, which is going to be difficult to respond to. But when it comes to archers, Mordor have one more option, which is even stronger, and that is the Temple Guard. You can see that their stats are much better. Again, it's another bodyguard unit, albeit in terms of archers at the very least, this is Mordor's only bodyguard option, but it's more than some factions have. They inspire nearby troops, but the main thing is going to be their armour-piercing arrows. Effective against armour. There are a few units in the game with this distinction. The steel bows, of course, for the Black Númenóreans, stolen goods, but also I think the Temple Guard, in terms of their melee stats, might have the edge over a couple of their peers in this regard, but again, it's the sort of thing which we can identify at greater detail later, perhaps, but they're certainly going to be able to hold their own in melee, not as well as the infantry units that we've already passed, but obviously when you combine that with the fact that you can do tons of damage with those armour-piercing arrows, very good at focusing down individual high-end units from opposition factions. If they leave them out in the open in front of the Temple Guard or units like them, they're fools, and you should take advantage of that. There are only 65 of them, however, so the DPS on them is hamstrung a little bit by that, but then that's probably for the best. I do remember the days when the Dunedain Steel Bowmen had a missile score of 18, and there were like over 100 of them in the unit, and they were broken. One of the best examples of a broken unit, perhaps. And finally, at least for this part, we have the artillery piece. The Troll Catapult, as it has been in the game for many a year now. The Catapult, we know what that's all about. Good at breaking down walls, better than the ballistas we've seen up until this point. And also you have that flaming shot, big splash damage, useful offensively and defensively in a siege, maybe less application in a field battle as the ballistas, but one thing that they do have in their favour is that the trolls will move the artillery pieces quicker. One thing that can be absolutely mind-numbing in Medieval 2 is the fact that artillery can spin on the spot, and it can, you know, the slow pace that the units try and move the artillery at can really ruin your plans. I mean, you have to be quite deliberate with other units of artillery, but you can be a little bit more reactionary with the Troll Catapult because they will move the artillery quicker, and it just gives you that better margin for error. Also, the trolls themselves, of course, are going to be that little bit more bulky in melee, but again, much like the troll drummers, they're not going to be that good. You know, they're more a sort of big squishy mass rather than anything that's going to win you the battle like the Olag High are. Anyway, we'll move on to the cavalry units, such as they are for Mordor now, as we round things off. So, Mordor's cavalry force of 3 units, albeit one with an armour upgrade, all of them very expensive, so Mordor are not going to have the most numerous cavalry force, but they can use them in a very specialised way, and much of it, at least the 3 traditional cavalry units, are much more about counteracting enemy cavalry units, all 3 being melee cavalry units. I say 3, one of them is the same unit with an armour upgrade. And the first is the Temple Inquisitors, which are the same as the Temple Executioners in terms of look, only on horseback, albeit unlike their footbound brethren, they don't have that second hit point, and they're not really a bodyguard unit as such. There are more of them, 74, pretty much your archetypal two-handed swordsman on horseback, very good at hunting down other cavalry units to a point. Of course, when it comes to trying to deal with the highest tier of cavalry that also have a bonus against fighting other horsemen, you may be in for a little bit of a tough time of it, but you can upgrade the armour, and when you look at the stats as well, good attack. The charge bonus, as it is with most melee cavalry outside of some exceptions, is not really the focus. All cavalry units are actually going to be able to do decent amounts of damage off the charge if there are enough of them left because of the masses of the horses, but don't expect them to absolutely crush a unit like a healthy unit of lancers can, who get a clean charge with lances down. They're going to be relying on the masses of the horses more than anything else. And like I said, they're a little bit more of a defensive unit. One thing that can undo Mordor if you're not careful, even with all their numbers, are some well-placed hammer and anvil charges. Morale can collapse, all of your low-tier units can abandon you, and like I said, that's where you can start to run into quite a few problems if you can't keep your army together. And this is one of the units which can help counteract that, though perhaps the more well-known unit is the bodyguard version of this, which is the Melkor's Abominations. 1500 is a lot of money, but they are one of the very best at what they do in the game. Not only do they do a good amount of damage, but they also scare enemy horses. They're an interesting kind of unit, this. I mean, with their maces and with these stats as well, they can be... Again, that cost is a lot for a unit which is ultimately going to be tasked with trying to safeguard the flanks and the rear of the army on an open field pretty much alone, unless you invest that little bit extra into the Temple Inquisitors, but in doing that you may leave yourself a little bit lightweight up front. But this is what the Orcs tend to prioritise in terms of their cavalry. As we go through the other three as well, you'll see that they do much the same sort of thing, maybe less dramatic than the Black Númenóreans riding Caragors that we see before us, but this is sort of par for the course for the Orcs, and that's, again, it goes to show that really in terms of shock value, they're trying to crush their enemies with sheer numbers more so than charging into them with lances down. Indeed, being on the receiving end of that in the movies didn't go too well for them. But yes, the Melkor's Abominations. I mean, total defense scores are pretty good as well. Defensive skill is high for a unit with a weapon such as that. Also a bit of a shield value as well. Only a 5 with those little shields as well. But considering the high armor, the second hit point, and the shields as well, like arrows are really not going to be too much your concern. You're going to be more worried about maybe your army starting to collapse, enemy anti-cavalry units maybe overrunning you, that sort of thing, and the fact that they're limited in numbers and are quite expensive. Speaking of which, the more aggressive option that Mordor have when it comes to their mounted units, the elephant class units, well, this is the first example of such that we've seen in the game really, the Beasts of Gorgoroth. Now, they aren't maybe quite as majestic as the Mumakil from Harad, which we'll talk about at a later date. 1500, the same price. They can run through enemy lines, and one thing they do have in their favour is the fact that their missile attack is a javelin. It's not going to be coming in the same sort of volume as the Orc javelins that we've seen before, but any of those javelins that hit is likely to result in a kill, especially against sort of armoured units. The one problem that they may have is the fact that, individually speaking, they're not actually as tanky as you might expect. 7 hit points is a lot, but the total defence is relatively low, honestly, and the armour is not that high, so the fact that there are so many of them, it may look like an intimidating sight, but if you can start to pick them off one by one, you will find that their power does start to dwindle as the game goes on. But we have seen numerous examples of the Beasts of Gorgoroth in a similar way to how we were mentioning the Olak High, the Trolls, and just the numbers of Mordor as a whole swarming forwards. Once you claim the momentum as Mordor, you can be difficult to stop, and the Beasts of Gorgoroth are maybe one of the most obvious ways that you can do that. We've seen it when Mordor are on the defence, sallying forward with the beasts and really putting the enemy under a good amount of pressure on the open field. The way that you can do this is obvious. You can really punch holes in the enemy line and start causing chaos, and very often chaos is Mordor's friend on the battlefield. And even when you're on the attack in a siege, if you are willing to hang back with them, maybe pepper the enemy with some javelins first and foremost, and then smash your way through the lines when they're looking a little bit weak, in those transitional phases they can be really strong. But among the elephant class units that the game has, they are a little bit easier to deal with on an individual basis, but because of how many of them there are, you could panic in the face of them, and like I've already said, chaos is most definitely your friend as Mordor 9 times out of 10. So there we have it, Mordor's roster. It's, in terms of their high tier options, they've got a lot, haven't they? It's kind of an interesting dynamic that they have as a faction. They're always going to have a very similar core of lower tier units, I think. You're always going to see a lot of those basic Uruks, the Orc Javelins, a couple of units of fodder maybe, but it's really your choices around your upper tier units which are going to define how you play as Mordor and how successful you are as Mordor as well, because like I said, one of the pitfalls you can fall into is getting a bit too greedy, going for too many of those bodyguard units and not really carrying the day enough in terms of your numbers, but also picking the wrong kinds of units against the wrong kinds of opponents can be pretty key, because as much as those numbers can be good for you as Mordor, they're not going to win you the battle. They're going to keep you in it, and then it's up to these higher end units to really see you over the line, I think, most of the time anyway. So yeah, it's just a matter of choice, really. It's your choice. So, what are we going to do next, I wonder? I think we will go back to another human faction next. I think we'll try and settle into a rhythm of going through the factions in series like that. It's going to be one of the forces of good men, I think, and well, I guess seeing as we're moving with some of the more iconic factions of Middle-earth, and considering some of the changes which have happened to Cavalry over the course of the development of this version of the game, I think it makes a good amount of sense for Rohan to be the next faction that we take a look at. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for that.